And I never believed that war could solve any problems. In my opinion, it creates more problems than it solves. I don't believe we should be there killing our GIs for oil. And in my opinion, that's the only reason we're there.
Even I can recognize the seriousness of what's going on over there. And for a while, I thought that Saddam Hussein was either a genius or a madman. Today, I lean toward madman because nobody's going to do the sort of thing that he's doing unless they're just a little bit more than crazy. If we don't stop this guy, while we have an opportunity, while we have the power and the force there, we're going to regret it.
Next, it's a discussion of the role of religion in the war in the Middle East. Our guest is the director of the Muslim Public Affairs Center, Salam al-Marayati, who joins us live from Los Angeles, California. He'll take your calls on religious wars, focusing on the jihad or holy war concept and the holy month of Ramadan.
Salam al-Marayati, director of the Muslim Public Affairs Center in Los Angeles. Of late, you have been speaking out quite a bit and writing pieces criticizing the media in the West and generally people in the West for their misperceptions of the culture and of Islam. What are 2 or 3 important misperceptions that the Western society has that you feel should be corrected?
Well, first of all, Islam is misperceived as an Arab religion, whereas in fact only 10% of the Muslim world is Arab. The majority of Muslims to date are actually in non-Arab countries, and the country with the largest Muslim population is Indonesia. More Muslims in Indonesia than there are in all of the Arab world. We have millions, tens of millions of Muslims in the Soviet Union and also in China. We have them in Southern Europe, we have them in Latin America, here in America. We have white Muslims, black Muslims, brown Muslims. We have every kind of ethnic group. So Islam is a universal religion. It is not an Arab religion. Secondly, within the Arab world, there are Arab Christians and Arab Jews. So not all Arabs are Muslims. As a matter of fact, in the Gulf itself, there are between 1 million to 1.5 million Christians in that region. So Islam is not an Arab religion. Secondly, Islam is looked upon as a cult, not as an Abrahamic faith, which it really is. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was a descendant of Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham, just like Jesus and Moses were descendants of Isaac, who was also the son of Abraham. So there's historical and theological unity within these 3 faiths. And all these 3 faiths in the religion of Islam are considered, or the followers thereof, are considered the people of the book. So they should have a special relationship, one of reconciliation and collaboration, that has really marked the history of our 3 faiths, not what we've seen in the last century, unfortunately.
Well, let me ask you then specifically, take these misperceptions and explain why they are important to know in the face of what's going on in the region right now.
Well, for example, when we just consider Islam as purely an Arab religion, we confine or imprison Islam to what's happening in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, there are dictatorships who do not represent Islam. They do not speak for Islam. They were imposed on the people of the religion. The Islamic forces, by and large, are opposed to these dictatorships and are struggling for human rights and democracy. It is time for American policy to realize that point and to focus on the people, to place the leadership in the people, not on these dictatorships that we've had for the last 40 to 50 years. As a matter of fact, U.S. policy, unfortunately, has only dealt with dictators. In 1953, the democratic leader of Iran was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was ousted by the CIA, in part, and the Shah of Iran replaced him again with the cooperation of the CIA. So the Muslim peoples of the land have not realized or are not convinced that U.S. policy is really focusing on the restoration of human rights and the democratization of the region. They feel that U.S. policy is more in alliance with dictatorships, be they friendly dictators like King Fahd or Hafiz al-Assad, or opposing dictators like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein at this time.
We are going to open our telephone lines in a few minutes so you can talk with Salam al-Marayati. He is director of the Muslim Public Affairs Center. It's based in Los Angeles. But tell our audience, please, what it is that your center does.
The Muslim Public Affairs Council is a public service agency aimed at disseminating accurate information about Islam and about Muslims throughout the world so that we could construct comprehensive policies where we begin to understand the Muslim people, not policies where we are continuously confronting the Muslim peoples simply because we don't understand their legitimate grievances and their true, sincere aspirations, the same aspirations, by the way, that we would have as American citizens in this country.
When you point to differences between the people and the government of certain countries in the region, specifically on Iraq, if you would, does Saddam Hussein reflect the wishes and beliefs of his people?
The Iraqi people never elected Saddam Hussein. He does not represent the true and basic sentiments of the people. The same argument can be made about King Fahd. If anything, the British had installed or empowered the House of Saud, which took power in the Arabian Peninsula, just like the monarchy of King Hussein in Jordan was made only and purely for the purpose of empowering that family in that region. So the Middle East, by and large, is run by these families or by these dictators, and again, do not represent the basic and true sentiments of the people. If, again, we had looked and focused to these people, we'd realize that these individuals and this population in that region are really in urgent need of a democracy, and they want to participate in the decisions of their countries concerning their nation now and forever.
Can I ask you a couple of very basic terms that people hear that are concerned with your religion, that maybe you can explain the context and what they mean? One, of course, is jihad, and we hear it said often, and maybe you can explain what it means and when it takes effect.
Well, jihad is misinterpreted in this country as holy war, and holy war is not recognized by Islam. Holy war actually originated in 11th century Europe when the Crusaders had invaded the Muslim world, and it actually started with the Spanish Inquisition that attacked Jews and Muslims who were living peacefully in Spain at that time. In any case, jihad means struggle. The individual struggle where I'm struggling against my base impulses and base desires because God had gifted humanity with the power of intellect. That's what separates us from the animal kingdom. We do not just react on our instincts. Number two, or secondly, there is the social struggle. And the example that we use is the Afghani Mujahideen, the Afghanis who were in a jihad, in a fight for their freedom upon the incursion of the Russians or the Russians invading their country. There was a resistance against that invasion. So they were in a social struggle against the Russians. Other forms of jihad, other examples could be the anti-apartheid struggle or even the American struggle for independence against British imperialism. These are all forms of jihad. So Muslims look at jihad as a precious term, as a genuine term, as a peaceful term, because it really explains our human desires and our human aspirations. Whereas here in the West, we only embody it or actually inject some kind of venomous element to it, thinking of it as just a violent campaign in destroying the whole world, first destroying the Jews, then destroying the Christians, and then the rest of the world. That is not the interpretation or the meaning of jihad whatsoever.
But when Saddam Hussein is said to have declared one, is that not what he means?
Well, first of all, any dictator can exploit any term of Islam, just like Yitzhak Shamir would exploit the Bible to justify his brutal occupation and subjugation of Palestinians, and just like Jerry Falwell or Billy Graham would use Christianity to even justify the brutality or the bombing of a people in the Gulf at this time. So you have various individuals who exploit Islam. Now, what it means for the people of Iraq to be in a jihad, if it means that they are defending their homeland at this time, then I think that is a legitimate argument. If it means that there is a justification for the invasion of Kuwait, absolutely not. There is no justification. As a matter of fact, Islamic activists throughout the world, by and large, have condemned the invasion of Kuwait because Kuwait is a sovereign state, just like Iraq is, and no one has the right to brutally unite any group, be that Saddam Hussein or King Fahd or Hafiz al-Assad.
I have one last question for you. I have lots more, but no time because I want to get to the callers. And your homeland is Iraq, correct?
That's correct. I'm from Baghdad.
Could you give people who haven't had a chance to talk to any natives of Iraq some sense of what it's like for you living in this country right now?
Well, first of all, I was raised in this country, in the United States, and I've learned the customs and the traditions, and I'm proud to be an American. I'm also a Muslim, and I feel that Islam is something that needs to be accepted in this country as a faith. It doesn't have, we're not in the business of converting people, because Islam has no clergy, it has no religious hierarchy, and it has no missionary. But at the same time, we would like to be respected, or at least Islam be respected, as a world faith. My heritage, my roots are in Iraq. My family, my grandparents, and most of my uncles and aunts are there. What's really troubling is not finding out any information about my family there. It's been somewhat, or actually quite a sterilized event. We have no information whatsoever about the people there. They are not with any water. Electricity has been cut off, and a lot of them are homeless, and there's no account absolutely of what's happening to the Iraqi people, who should not be blamed for what's happening in the Gulf at this time. As a matter of fact, they did not elect, or they did not choose for the invasion of Iran, and they did not choose for the invasion of Kuwait either, and they shouldn't pay the consequences for those actions.
Let's take our first question. Virginia Beach, Virginia, you're on the air.
Yes. I'm sort of puzzled because I was stationed in Saudi Arabia once quite a while back when I was on active duty in the Air Force, and I noticed that they had a greeting, something like Salam alaikum and alaikum salam, which means peace be upon you, or words to that effect. Now, we see, you just made the comment that you want to see the Muslims accepted, yet it is very hard to reconcile that statement of peace and then to witness the blowing up of 240 Marines in Beirut, the blowing up of the Pan Am 103 plane, blowing a 6-month-old baby, her mother and grandmother, out of an airplane at 15,000 feet, killing a little Natasha Simpson in an air terminal, 11 years old. She was on her knees, wounded, and they killed her. Now, these are thugs.
All right, sir. Thanks. Let's get a response from our guest.
Well, I don't think that any Iraqi would feel that these bombs and missiles that are now targeting Iraq and destroying that country are meant in the name of democracy or in the name of peace at all. And I think they would have the same questions as this individual has about what's happened to American lives. And I can sympathize with that person, because I have the same feelings not only about American lives, but about all human beings, whether it's Latin American human beings or Arabic human beings or American human beings. I think we're all one family. We're all the children of Adam. Secondly, we don't know exactly how these things came about. We never know how violence is ever justified. Islam condemns terrorism, just like Christianity and Judaism do, but there may be adherents of these faiths or followers of these faiths that are aberrations of these religions, and we should accept them whether they are Muslim, Christian, or Jew. And again, I can point out examples of Christian terrorism, be that in Ireland or in Colombia or in Latin America, as well as Jewish terrorism, especially in the occupied territories. I don't think that losing 3 to 4 Palestinians on the average as a result of the brutality of the Israeli regime is any way justifiable in Judaism. I don't think that we are making that mistake in associating that kind of terrorism with Judaism, and we're just saying that nobody should make that same kind of association with Islam whatsoever.
Los Angeles, California, next on the air.
Yeah, I'd like to know if I'm under a misconception that in the Muslim world that the people that practice Islam look at people that don't practice the faith of Islam as being infidels. Is that a misconception, or is it true that they look at us as being infidels?
All right, sir. Thank you very much for the call.
Right. Muslims do not look at non-Muslims as infidels. Muslims actually, in the Quran itself, we see that Jews and Christians and other people who follow the Word of God and who worship God will be rewarded in paradise. Again, I mentioned that Jews and Christians are people of the book, and they have a special status in any Muslim society. That's why through 800 years of experience in Spain, the Jews and Muslims were collaborating, were living in coexistence. After the Jews were kicked out of Spain upon the Spanish Inquisition, where did they go? They went to Turkey for peace and prosperity there. They were protected there. So Muslims don't look at Jews and Christians as infidels whatsoever. That is, again, a foreign term, that's a Western terminology, and that has been imposed on the Islamic faith, and we reject that terminology altogether.
San Antonio, Texas, you're next.
Yes, I wanted to ask him a question concerning the Palestinians and the Jews. It seems to me like the conflicts that they are, conflicting on each other goes, far back, as far as in the Bible, and it's still like they are still battling those religious conflicts today, which I'm really trying to see. What is the purpose of them still killing each other like they are?
So you're wondering whether or not the whole situation is resolvable?
Yes.
Well, I think also what he's referring to is that will war resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And I think that it will not resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There has to be negotiations, there has to be a respect for one another, there has to be a one-to-one relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Number two, war will not solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and war will not resolve this conflict whatsoever. War fundamentally will defeat the purposes of peace and security in the region. There has to be, again, a restoration of human rights, whether it's a Jew, Christian, or a Muslim, and an establishment of a consistent policy for pure democracy or democratization in the region. Secondly, to use religious documents, whether it's the Torah, or the Gospel, or the Quran, to justify brutality is reprehensible in all faiths, and I think we should stop using religious documents as documents of real estate to claim territory for the Holy Land, wherever that may be. And I think that's the first fundamental error that people are making about this crisis. They try to link it to some religious issue. It's not religious, it's completely political.
Drake, Massachusetts. Caller, go ahead, please.
Hello. I'm a little nervous, so please forgive me. But in the Quran, it states when Muhammad's favorite daughter Fatima died, that it was written, that he wrote that she was just below the blessed... No, excuse me, I'm sorry. In the Quran, when Muhammad's favorite daughter Fatima died, he wrote that she was just below the Blessed Virgin.
So what's the point, though?
The point, well, in Portugal, in Portugal, there is a place named after Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. And in 1917, our Blessed Virgin appeared to 3 Portuguese children with her peace plan from heaven.
Okay, and the point that you're making about all this is what?
Is that I hope everyone will start praying to our Blessed Virgin in Fatima. And also, I also wanted to mention that Mary was born of the house of David, and I'm so nervous.
Well, that's okay. I think you made your point. We'll let you go. I appreciate it. I guess it goes back to the historical roots you were drawing between the 3 religions earlier.
Yeah, but I think she must have been misinformed about Muslims praying to a virgin, because we don't pray to any individual. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is considered a virgin, and the birth of Jesus was a virgin birth. We believe in the Immaculate Conception, but we don't pray to any virgins, be they the Prophet Muhammad's daughter or Mary herself, because we don't worship human beings. We only worship the one Creator, and we don't associate any partners with Him. As a matter of fact, we're offended when we're called Mohammedans. And Mohammedanism was a common terminology used to describe us, because Mohammedanism implies that we worshipped Muhammad. And that is, again, the worst sin in our religion. That's why we say that we are Muslims, we are the followers of Islam, and do not follow or actually worship any human being whatsoever.
Another call from Los Angeles.
Hi, how you doing? You mentioned that those who the dictators in the Arab world are the ones that are really violating the tenets of Islam by subjecting their beliefs, imposing their beliefs on those who didn't vote for them. But it seems to me that there's also more of a grassroots. It seems to me that also that takes place among grassroots, among the general population. For example, are the Palestinian Muslim Arabs in the West Bank violating the tenets of Islam when they spontaneously cheer the bombing of Israel by Iraqi Scud missiles?
Well, I mean, that's equivalent to how the stock market shot up 100 points when Baghdad was being bombed, and there was a fervor. There was a Rambo mentality that locked into our minds here in America. And people began cheering the bombing of the country when we don't even know what's happening to Iraq whatsoever and what's happening to the civilian population there. And also there are reports that the people in Tel Aviv cheered the bombs as they were being sailed over to Iraq. So the war does present these consequences that I resent, that I think are completely preposterous, and be they American or Arab or Israeli, I think that we have to sit down and begin reconciling these issues without relying on these emotions and pointing to each other's emotions as the basis for our policy or the basis for our judgment of one another.
Our next question comes from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Good evening, sir. It was nice to hear you mention the Golden Age in Spain when Jews and Muslims lived very closely together and very successfully. However, I have been observing the reporting on the war, and I haven't heard any Muslim leaders denouncing the Scud attacks on Israel, where there are about 500,000 Muslim Israeli citizens, not the people in the West Bank, but Israeli citizens. Plus, there's a sizable Christian community there, and as well as the people on the West Bank. And these people, I mean, I could see you might think that the Jewish Israelis were involved, but these people are just bystanders. Yet,
well, I didn't hear any. I mean, by the same token, we didn't hear any condemnation of the missiles that are being launched against Saudi Arabia and the civilian population there. And again, the problem is not only in the transmittance of these condemnations, because, for example, our institution did condemn any civilian bombings, be they against Muslims, Christians, or Jews. The problem is also in the receiving end, in that do we hear from each other? Have you heard from me, or do I hear from you? We've relied more on what we've heard about each other from other people and from other sources, but I don't think that you've come to me or I've come to you in actually discussing these issues as human beings and as individuals. So we should hear from each other as often as possible instead of just hearing about each other.
We were talking earlier about some of the terminology. Many people are hearing in the news that the Holy Month is coming up. What does that mean? What's the implication?
The implication is that the month is called Ramadan. That's the month that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And that's the month of fasting where we learn self-restraint as Muslims. So Muslims throughout the world, 1 billion followers of the religion of Islam, will fast from sunrise to sunset, the crack of dawn to sunset.
What's likely to be the effect on soldiers who are fighting there who are Muslim?
Well, it's already affecting them now because they don't have any food. And it's not just the Iraqis, of course, that we're talking about when we refer to Muslims, because there are Muslims on both sides. The Muslim world is divided, the Arab world is divided, and unfortunately this region has had to deal with a policy of divide and conquer. When they opposed the Turks in 1917, they divided the Arabs from the Turks. When Iraq had invaded Iran, the Arabs were divided against the Persians. Now it's the people of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, are divided against the people of Iraq. And unfortunately, this policy of division and conquering the region has to end.
Indianapolis.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question of your guest about what I see as maybe a distinction between the Arab culture and the Western culture and our values. It seems to me that first of all, religion plays such an important part in your culture, even more so than in our culture. Sometimes when I see what I would call fanaticism, I can only compare it to maybe the the most strident Bible-beating Southern Baptist or something that I can imagine, and there tends to be a narrow-mindedness about the way you view the world. There seems to be a cruelty there, that a lack of a sense of values. That, for example, when you look at not just what Saddam Hussein is doing now, but what Assad did in the village of Hama, the incredible cruelty and the killing of civilians without recourse. I know it's easy to victimize. I know that we tend to dehumanize those people, you know, like the Iraqis, and we shouldn't do that. But there does seem to be a difference in the way you view life and we do.
Thank you.
Well, I do reject that terminology, because when you say that I view life differently, you're actually meaning that I am inferior because I'm different from you. I'm not different from you. I'm just as much a human being as anyone else. And when you use words like fanaticism and narrow-mindedness and we don't have values, those are hate-filling words. Those are words that have some kind of politicized or politically charged value to those words. It's like asking someone, do you beat your wife? Have you solved your wife-beating problem? That's a loaded question when you ask people like that. And unfortunately, it goes both ways. I think there are people in the Middle East who look at America in that light, that it is corrupt, that there is a problem of violence and drugs, and that women are sexually exploited, and by and large that may be true in some parts of this country. And then when we look towards the other way, we try to dehumanize and to vilify the people there. And basically this madness has to end at some point, because we cannot rely on this kind of terminology or on this kind of assessment anymore. Why? Because technologically we have advanced. We can do business with people halfway across the world, but we still don't understand their religion, and we still don't understand them. We still look at them as inferior beings. So that's why we reject such terminology, and we should look each other eye to eye, person to person, one to one, rather than thinking that one is inferior to the other.
Does global communications and the fact that people are doing business around the world make you optimistic about the future?
Well, actually, when journalists go and visit Muslim communities, when journalists come out of certain nations and countries in the region over there, throughout the Muslim world, and when people do business with Muslims, they're the ones who usually have a very positive image. I recall many reports that I've seen in the last couple of days, Americans who are living in Jordan, for example, who've been asked to leave, but they say no, they love the people, they love the culture, and they're not going to leave. And the same thing can be said about any culture in that region, be it Iraq, or Egypt, or even the Arabian Peninsula. People fall in love with the people over there if they only see the human side of Islam instead of relying on what we hear about each other through the media or through various reports that are usually very subjective and sometimes biased about one another.
15 minutes left in our discussion. Las Cruces, New Mexico is next.
Yes, I'd like to ask the young man, he was talking earlier about the leaders in that part of the country. What does he consider King Hussein of Jordan? Was he put in power by what he was talking about a little earlier, by organizations or, whatever?
Well, I really don't understand the question, but basically, again, the dictators in the region, be they monarchies or military dictatorships, we oppose them. We feel that the people need to take charge and control their own destiny if they want to resolve the fundamental problems in the region. And even King Hussein, who has bent more towards democratization in the region, he has a parliament now, but still we need to see 100% democratization in the region. And we need to see the same thing happening in various other areas of that part of the world. Secondly, I think I want to refer back to the previous caller when he mentioned the city of Hama that was leveled. Yes, it was leveled by a brutal dictator, Hafiz al-Assad, and the Islamic opposition to Hafiz al-Assad is the strongest one in that country, as a matter of fact. Muslims throughout the world resent the fact that our president, President Bush, went and shook hands with this brutal dictator, and again acknowledging that we only deal with dictators and we don't deal with the people. Even Saddam Hussein was supported by our administration up until August 2nd. We built his military, we built his intelligence, we tempted him to invade Iran, and that's what led to this brutal dictatorship in that region at this time.
How do governments deal with the people directly?
By understanding the opposition groups that are in that country, by looking to human beings who represent this opposition. For example, in South Africa, when we needed to understand the legitimate grievances of the people, what did we do? We talked to Tutu, we talked to Reverend Bosak, we talked to the anti-apartheid leaders. The same thing needs to be done in the Muslim world, where we deal with people who are only concerned with the restoration of human rights and democracy, whereas the rest of those, we shouldn't concentrate so much on them and not focus on them so much. That way we could prevent crises from, like this one from occurring again.
Ocala, Florida, you're next.
Hi, yes. My husband is in Saudi Arabia. He's one of the military people there. And I want to thank your guest, first of all, for helping us to understand Iraqis. I think we need more of this. And I hope maybe some of the level of questioning will get beyond stereotypes associated with the Muslim world. They all sound as preposterous as assuming that all Americans are alike or that we all are represented by dissidents. I have a couple of questions, so I'm not sure how many you're going to allow me. First of all, one of the things that I've heard that in Quran, or at least in the Muslim belief, that there is some reference that Muslims are not to be subjugated by the Jews, and I wonder if that is a basis in the Quran. Should I go on with questions?
Sure.
Okay. Another one, I was wondering what the effect of Ramadan will have on the war. I know that obviously there's been Ramadan in past wars, how Iran and Iraq, for example. How do soldiers, how will they be able to observe Ramadan but also be in the war if that happens? Hopefully it'll be over by then. Then again, I wonder too, just personally, when was the last time he had communication with his family in Iraq? And then also, is there significant dissent against Hussein in Iraq? And is it possible he could be toppled? I'm not considering the current circumstance, but given the repression and control that he seems to have in the country, is it even possible that anything like that could happen?
Thank you very much.
Well, on the first question, when it deals with the Quran, in the Quran, no one should be subjugated by anyone. In other words, if a Muslim subjugates a Jew, it's wrong. If a Jew subjugates a Muslim, it's wrong. So to us, we take off our blinds and consider injustice against any human being as just that, injustice, regardless of who's the perpetrator and who's the victim. And that is a fundamental Quranic point, as a matter of fact. And the Quran warns the Muslims that if they act unjustly against any group of non-Muslims, then God will levy a punishment against us, Muslims, on the Day of Judgment. So we are very concerned about that, and we've been admonished by the Quran and by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, about this issue. Secondly, on the issue of Ramadan, I'm not sure how much of an effect Ramadan will have on this war. The war may be over by that time, because Ramadan begins on March 17th. Several wars have been fought through Ramadan. Actually, in Iran, between Iran and Iraq, for example, it was an 8-year war, so 8 Ramadans passed by when there was fighting at that time. On the issue of my family, we haven't had communications with them since the bombing began, because telecommunications has been completely cut off from that country, and also power, electricity, and water has been cut off in that country as well. On the issue of whether people can be empowered to topple these wicked dictatorships, and I don't want to use just the example of Iraq, but I also want to talk about the rest of the countries, because I think it's just as important. Saudi Arabia, and Syria, and Egypt, and Libya, Tunisia and Algeria, so on and so forth. These countries, if there was a drop of democracy in that region that could be applied and that could be fortified by policy in some way, in some manner, then we could see that region change over overnight, like we saw democracy flourish throughout Eastern Europe. And in that case, we supported democratization in Eastern Europe. But there's got to be a change in policy where we can not only support it in Hungary and Poland, but resist it in Iran or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. That to me is racism, actually, and that has to end. Secondly, Ceausescu or the Shah of Iran or Ferdinand Marcos withered into oblivion when the people took charge and when the people finally said, we want to control our destiny in our own hands and not rely on any external forces or rely on any dictators to control our fate. So these people were toppled. They were dictators by their own people. For some people, it took many years. For some others, it took just a matter of days to topple their dictatorships. So we don't know how long it would take to deal with these dictatorships in the Middle East.
Moline, Illinois.
Yes, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the speaker for his comments and his response to the questions. This is a voice that more people should hear, I think. in this country. Secondly, I'd like to say, and I'd like to comment later from him perhaps about violence against Muslim Americans or people of the Muslim faith in the United States. I personally deplore that, and I think that all right-thinking people should deplore that as a wrong response to what's going on. I'd like to also echo what he said. I lived in Turkey for quite some time and got to know the people there very well beyond the stereotypes that I think most people had of the Turks, and got to know them as people, and found that they are people just like us. And then lastly, I'd like to say that I'd like to ask if one were to write to the Muslim Public Affairs Center, if one could get information about Islam from your center.
Sure. I think, Susan, do you have the address?
It's on as you speak.
Okay, great. So you can write to that address, and we'd be more than happy to send you the articles that we've published and the comments we've made on some of the more contemporary issues involving American Muslims and Muslims throughout the world. And I appreciate your comments, sir, because we also need to hear from people like you more often. That encourages our efforts and encourages the American Muslim community to become more active. Secondly, on the issue of violence and terrorism, yes, American Muslims have been the victims of terrorism in this country. They haven't been the culprits. Contrary to what the FBI reports are saying, contrary to what the Justice Department is doing, we feel that we've been shortchanged in terms of our civil liberties in this country. And unfortunately, because of the biasness that comes out from the Middle East or from the media here on certain occasions, we have been associated with terrorism as if I am more inclined to commit an act of terrorism than any other American citizen. And that, again, is bigotry and racism, and we resent that completely. Alex Ode was a person who was assassinated and who was a victim of terrorism in 1985. His culprits, the culprits of his assassination, have not been brought to justice recently, and this happened in 1985. So we feel that we've been wronged, and we feel that the policy has to change so that consistently we can apply them to any group of people. You can be involved in terrorism, but that doesn't mean that you have to belong to a certain ethnic group or to a certain religious group to be more inclined to commit that terrorist act. And again, we'd like to see a change of policy where we're treated as American citizens and our patriotism is not challenged, whether in times of war or in times of peace.
Our next question is once again from Los Angeles.
Yes. First, I'd like to say that if your viewers looked at a map that was drawn to scale, they would see that there are 22 Arab countries, and then there's Israel. Israel is 1/650th of the size, the total size of the Middle East. And I'd like to talk about linkage. I think that the linkage we should be looking at is the Palestinians that have aligned themselves with the Butcher of Baghdad and aligned themselves with Iraqis. And that's the linkage that people should see. And I think every time that there's a Palestinian that wants to make peace with Israel, that's a moderate Palestinian, a moderate Muslim, that he's murdered by his own people, I would like your guest to say, how does he expect there to be peace between Israel? Israel would love to have peace. It would like to have secure borders. How does he think that they can make peace?
Well, I think, again, that the people there are not convinced that Israel wants to have peace. I think Israel pays a lot of lip service to peace, but their actions actually contradict their comments. And if you want to talk about linkage, whether people are going to affiliate with the Butcher of Baghdad, we see, or at least the people in Palestine see, that the U.S. administration is affiliating with the Butcher of Beirut, who is Ariel Sharon, and that the Israeli radical right is gaining power, not the peace movement inside of Israel. So our policy in the United States, again, should focus on the people, should focus on democracy and human rights, and then in that case, it would empower the moderates on both sides. Right now, our policy is only encouraging extremists on both sides, and there is extremist policy definitely in Israel. At this point, even though Israel is small in size, even though it doesn't have any borders at this time, we don't know what borders Israel wants to have in the near future, because there is a policy or a philosophy of Eretz Israel, or Greater Israel, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which actually is endangering a lot of the Palestinian and Arab population in the region. We would like to see that there is consistent policy. The point I was trying to make is that in Israel, even though it is a small country, it is the military superpower in the region. And now that the United States has engaged in an assault on Iraq and completely destroyed the military capability and the defense capability of Iraq at this time, the only power left in the region is Israel. It has the most sophisticated weaponry. It has atomic, nuclear, chemical and biological weaponry. It is the military superpower in the region, so nobody really should think that Israel is under any threat. If anything, the threat is being imposed now on the Palestinians at this time because they are next to the military superpower of the region. And again, we have financially rewarded Israel, even though it's committed acts of aggression in the last 20 to 30 years in its invasion of Lebanon and its annexation of southern Lebanon in 1982. As a matter of fact, we've rewarded them by $3 billion a year, and we continue to provide them intelligence, even though some of their members had committed espionage in our country, Jonathan Pollard being one, and so many others. We have this one-sided policy that's been the hallmark of the U.S. administration for the last 40 to 50 years.
Let me jump in because we have just 90 seconds. We're going to try to get a question in from Lansing, Michigan. Caller, very quickly.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to say is he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, and I don't mean to be rude to you. The reality of it is, as you said earlier, that there are populations that have overthrown these dictators like Marcos and what have you. I think as a Vietnam veteran and looking at this thing, that what's happening is we're in there. The people of Iraq are backing Hussein. If not, to use his own words, they would have turned the man out. The reality of it is we're over there to stop this aggression, stop them from going into Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries so we can have a democracy over there and not worry about having these dictators rule.
All right, sir, thanks. 30 seconds.
Well, time will tell whether we support democracy in the future or not. And again, we have supported dictatorships. We have not supported the democratic movements. We know of democratic movements in those regions, in Saudi Arabia and in Syria and in Iraq, and the United States policy has not supported those democratic movements whatsoever, and that has to change.
Salam al-Marayati is one of the founders of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. He's been director of the organization for the past 3 years. By training, he is a chemical engineer, receiving both a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of California system. Homeland is Baghdad, emigrated to the United States in 1964. I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon to talk with our audience.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for your questions and comments.
That concludes our evening call-in programs this evening. A note to join us tomorrow evening at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time, when the guest on our call-in will be Republican Representative Kurt Weldon of Pennsylvania. He's a member of the Research and Development and the Sea Power subcommittees of the Armed Services Committee, and he'll join us to take your calls on the war in the Middle East. Again, that's tomorrow evening at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:15 on the West Coast. We'll take a break now for a look at the schedule.
Good evening from Washington. You're watching C-SPAN, a public service of the cable television industry. We're taking a short break now to update our schedule, and we have a reminder to join us for live coverage of a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on the 1992 budget request for international affairs and an update on the war in the Gulf. Secretary of State James Baker is the scheduled witness at the hearing. Again, that's live coverage of a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Looking at what's ahead tonight, next it's remarks by President Bush at a news briefing held earlier today. Right after that, we will bring you today's Pentagon briefing, in which members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff offered the latest assessment of the war in the Middle East. At 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, it's a Senate Budget Committee hearing about President Bush's $1.5 trillion fiscal year 1992 federal budget proposal. Budget Director Richard Darman testified at the hearing today. Then we will air today's military briefings from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Beginning at 12:40 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:40 p.m. Pacific Time, you will see representatives of the British, Saudi, and U.S. military discuss Operation Desert Storm. That will be followed by today's closing plenary session of the 1991 winter meeting of the National Governors Association. The nation's governors heard from Senator Alan Simpson and Congressman Richard Gephardt at today's session. At about 4:20 a.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 Pacific Time, it's remarks by Senator Joseph Biden, Democrat of Delaware. Last night, he spoke before the Kennedy Political Union at American University and discussed major issues facing the United States. Then you will hear from Alaska's independent governor, Walter Hickel. He spoke before the National Press Club today about Alaska and energy policy. Finally, at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, we will start the day with a live viewer call-in program with our guest, the President of the European Parliament. And that's a look at the upcoming schedule here on C-SPAN. Thanks for joining us.